This is our summit, our final reporting back day for serious play to the participants and to interested parties. And we've got a packed program, so I'll try not to speak fast but to move fast. Serious Play was a 3-year Australian Research Council funded national project. It was the only funded project in the particular round we applied for in education. So we were delighted to achieve that. We've worked across 9 schools in Queensland and Victoria, 3 primary and 6 secondary schools, with students aged from 5 to 15 and 32 teachers. The academic team is comprised of myself, Michael Deswani, Joan Mara, Sarah Prestridge, Leonie Rowan, Jason Zagami and Yam San Chi from Singapore. Initially we also had Professor Claire White-Smith, who's now moved to Australian Catholic University. You've probably met at least one or more of our team and also one or more of our fabulous research assistants, Roberta Thompson and Christy McGillivray in Victoria. We've also been immensely fortunate to have Colleen Styler-Hunt working with us effectively as a part-time research fellow really on the team, and Geraldine Townend, who, amongst many other things, will be timekeeping today. She says she's going to hold up signs, but I can't see her, so I'm safe for the moment. Okay, so it's a 3-year project, and it arose because a number of us have been working for a while, members on the academic research team and other people amongst the teachers and others of you here, very interested in the potential of digital games to support learning, but also concerned about some of the fairly sweeping claims and assumptions that are made about it without really looking at what it means for different schools, different teachers, different kids, and on the ground. We're very conscious, for example, that there are assumptions that all kids love games, that all kids are good at games, that all teachers are hopeless at technology. I'm one, but that's a different issue. Assumptions that playing at home is the same as playing at school. Assumptions that all we need is fun, and everything will be better. And we felt there's a really, really important need for voices from the profession, from us, from teachers, from kids, from schools, to talk about what it's really like, to explore what it's really like, not from a position of it's not going to work, but from a realistic, grounded position and awareness of the possibilities and a determination to find out more about what circumstances, what games, what kinds of kids, what kinds of learning, what kinds of teaching make this work the best. And I think it's reasonable to say that all the teachers and all the schools in the project have stepped a little outside their comfort zone and done fantastic things. And if they were doing them in their comfort zone, they certainly look pretty exciting. And we've learnt a lot. And we see today, in large part, as a chance to share some of that work. So, in terms of the timeline, we were actually funded from the middle of 2012 to the middle of 2014 because we wanted to get the full 3 calendar years work in schools. This means we still have 6 months to run. We're finishing in May next year. So where we are at the moment is at a point where we've got the last semester, after we finished our work with school, to look across the data and do some more sustained analysis. So what you're seeing today is not the final analysis. What you're seeing today are some early indicators, some headline findings, some patterns of we're observing across the group. We've begun to publish and analyse the work from the first year of the project, but we're at our almost final stage, but not quite. We thought about waiting another 6 months before we had this occasion, but we really felt that the end of the year and the end of the work in school was the right time to mark this occasion. These were the questions that we started with. How do students approach games in the classroom? How do classrooms change play? What can teachers do? What kind of teaching are going to best enable us to support the kinds of learning that games can provide? What opportunities are there for games do games provide for creativity, production and innovation? There was a very strong feeling amongst the academic team and amongst the teachers that we've talked to that you've got to have making as well as playing and using. So some members of some members of some of the schools and some members of the team have been working very actively in making games as well as the analysis and playing with games. This project has arisen way back out of the interest of many of us in the nature of literacy and learning, the changing nature of kids' communicative worlds. Unlike many projects, in fact most projects that are concerned with digital games and learning, our project comes primarily from a more sociocultural stance, but we've been immensely enriched by having a breadth of experience and a breadth of disciplines here, including work in ICT and learning, including work from media studies and other areas. So we had 6 foci, and that's what we're going to be talking to you about shortly. The ways in which students with widely different preferences and experiences of games and digital culture approach digital games-based teaching in the classroom. Now, I'd probably approach digitally games-based learning, which is an indication of some of the things we've learned from working with the schools over the last 3 years. The ways in which the experience of play changes in classroom contexts, the ways in which teachers can work most effectively with games, and the kinds of pedagogical practices and approaches that best capitalise on games' capacities. We wanted to look, as I said, at creativity, production, innovation, a very strong interest in looking at digital literacies and the ways in which learning through games challenge and extend multimodal literacy learning. And we were very interested to look at that whole question of assessment and whether and how and if there should be some kind of assessment framework formally developed. I'll hand over to the next section. Our structure basically is that each of the team members is going to speak fairly briefly about one aspect of the project. Sandy Musprat, who's done amazing statistical analysis for us in 2012 and again just this year, will give us the first airing of the 2014 results from the students' surveys. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Dr. Joanne O'Mara from Deakin University, Victoria.
Hi everyone. Now, I'm going to just have to fiddle with this. Just in beginning, I'm going to be talking about the first aim, which was looking at the students' approaches to having game learning. One of the things that Catherine mentioned is that given the findings of the project, we would have actually changed the way we framed that and thought about teaching and learning, because obviously the two are very interwoven. And if you have a look at some of the things I have on the slide, I've really talked about teachers and students together in this. So that's one of the things that we would definitely change. Part of what we were responding to in setting this up was the idea that there are a lot of myths around games which are promulgated in the community, and there's also a lot of anxiety around things to do with digital technology. And we'd found from our previous work that obviously things were a lot saner and a lot more educationally focused when they were in schools. And at the time, we were also really responding to the idea that there could be, on the other hand, gamification of the curriculum, which we found a lot of written about in newspapers and things, which had this sense of, Microsoft Inked or someone might be able to replace the bad work of teachers. I mean, that's how I oversimplify that idea, but there still is a lot of press around that. And so this is really where this comes from, to look at what might really happen in your classrooms when you work with games, with your pedagogies to reach your students and the curriculum, and then how do students who have a really varied amount of understanding and usage of games respond to that, and what will they learn from that? Again, there's this idea about the students being digital natives, which we question. Obviously, many of them are growing up in technology-saturated households, but through the project, we also have children from families with little or no technology. We also have students from families where there's a lot of technology, but the children aren't allowed to access that technology. And I suppose, when we send out the permission forms, I've had conversations with parents who, one parent who their child has to carry a rock around in their pocket to be connected to nature. And they're very adamant that technology is a bad thing. And I've also had conversations with some parents who, are really worried about the mobile towers everywhere and the increased use of wireless and how might this impact upon their children's learning. So, there's a really wide range of stances and opinions in the community, and that's part of what we're addressing in this project, and part of the work that all of the teachers, particularly in the room, have been addressing on an everyday basis. What does it mean to be a child now? What are the ranges of gaming experiences that the children have had? And then how might we work with that productively and effectively? One of the things which we feel is really important about this is that because there isn't a lot of theorised understanding both in the academy and also in the general sort of conversations about games in schools, it actually impedes teachers' abilities, not their own abilities, but, the possibilities of them to use games. And so part of our motivation is to, collect these fabulous case studies that we have and use them as enabling devices for other teachers. There's quite a bit of data that connects to my topic that we've collected through the project, including data from the surveys, also mostly from the case study data, teacher interviews. One little snapshot that I thought captured this was one of the teachers I've been working with from Beck's school in the first year of the project, when he looked at, his students' experiences of games when he was doing some game making. He found that there was quite a lot of gender difference in how much even the young children were using games, and also in the way that they chose to make the games. And so when he worked through the next year doing a similar project, he reconstructed the whole thing to make sure that everybody was really pushed in their boundaries. And that's the kind of thing that we're really interested in, like looking at the gender assumptions and how they might be broken, and looking at, how people can work with this. These are the findings I have. These are just emerging findings, and we have sort of data to back this up. But there's another range of things that we have from the project as well around this. So first of all, this is obvious to this room full of teachers who have been doing the work over the last 3 years, but using games isn't just a matter of Microsoft Inc. doing Teaching Inc. It uses the same kind of pedagogical approaches and strategies as you always have to use. A lot of thinking on your feet, a lot of reflective practice, a lot of complex decision making. Also, the range of student disposition and student experience is a lot broader than perhaps we might assume at the beginning, because we feel that everyone knows how to do everything. And, there's just this huge range. So you really need to question the idea of what is a digital native. Is that a very valid way of talking about students? And we often slip that as kind of language into what we say. But what does that mean? And we would all critique that anyway. The next thing is that we really observe that most teachers had very positive experiences working with games, but for some students, they felt like they were quite out of their comfort zone. So often high-performing students felt a little bit ill at ease by this, and I felt that kind of disruption was often very productive for classrooms, and so did many of the teachers that I've talked with. So that was really interesting. Also, I've had numerous examples of teachers talking about the ways in which students who are often not enabled to excel in other areas of the curriculum can become the leaders of this sort of work. And I think that's a really powerful outcome from the work that we've done, and also a great place to us to finish, to think about, how games are actually quite an inclusive sort of topic to use, and a topic and an inclusive way of actually approaching some of our pedagogy and teaching and learning in our classrooms. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. Hi, I'm Michael Dejuani from QUT, and it's been fantastic to be part of this project with researchers from across a range of institutions, both here in Queensland and in Victoria. And of course with such a range of schools who have all been engaging with this project in so many rich and interesting ways. My focus kind of, it's very much associated with Joe's focus in that I'm also interested in these connections between what students do with games at home and then how we might use them in the classroom. And so I guess I'm, one of the ways that I want to frame this is to think about games as a resource for teaching, as a kind of piece of content or an experience that we can provide to students in the classroom that complements other curriculum activities and other aspects of pedagogy. So one of the things that this raises then is how play changes when we bring it into the classroom, because we know that children and young people play games in certain kinds of ways at home that necessarily have to change when those games are introduced into the classroom, because classrooms are different kinds of spaces and environments and systems than home spaces. Okay, so my focus is to better understand the relationship between digital games in and out of school, what the connections are, what the similarities and differences are in gameplay in and out of school. So we've spent a fair bit of time throughout the project trying to ascertain what students do with games outside of the classroom, what they want to, why they play games and so on. The reason it becomes interesting for an education context, of course, is because we see young people building knowledge in informal environments outside of school. So we see young people who don't seem to be engaged at all in a classroom, who will, in their own time at home, spend hours engaging with information, researching online, problem solving, digging really deep, networking, doing all of these things that we would want to see them doing in the classroom, except they're not doing it in the classroom. So I guess that's where some of the hype and excitement comes from in terms of the potential for games in the classroom, because we do see young people engaging in these very complex, sophisticated ways outside of the classroom. And of course, James G, in his book, What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Literacy and Learning, really focuses on this quite a lot and explores why young people are motivated to learn in a gaming system when they might not be engaged to learn in a formal classroom situation. So to explore this further in the project, there's really been 3 points of data collection, I suppose. One was a survey that we conducted early in the project, early in 2012, where we asked students to tell us the types of games they were playing, what they liked about playing games, and whether or not they thought it was a good idea to bring games into the classroom. We've also obviously conducted lots of interviews with students throughout the project at various points in time. And we've also, in some of the schools, we have undertaken this home photography project where we've asked students to take photographs of their home gameplay and then write about that. So we've asked them to take 5 photographs of different aspects of their home gameplay, to have the family members take photographs of them playing games in that home situation, and then to answer a range of questions about what they're doing with those games. So perhaps, why they like playing that game, are there rules about their gameplay, do they play different kinds of games in different situations, and so on. And do they play alone or do they play with other people? So, as Joe said, these are really emerging findings and things that we really need to delve deeper into the data to kind of reinforce or to kind of see that our assumptions or the things that we're starting to see are being supported. But some of the things that are, we can say, I think, are that students do not automatically accept the use of games in the classroom. Joe mentioned that sometimes more academic students don't want to do gaming in the classroom because it challenges their, ability to have already sort of mastered the art of schooling. So they're challenged to learn in a different kind of way, and playing a game is not part of that typical way of learning. So that can be a difficulty. But also, young people might not want to bring their fun experiences into the classroom. They might not want to, school their popular cultural experiences. The kind of knowledge that students develop when they're playing games is not necessarily, valued by the school system. And we certainly saw evidence of this during the project, where students, who were expert game players and were able to, be experts in their classrooms through their gameplay, weren't necessarily achieving well at school, and the expertise they had in those games didn't necessarily help them to achieve any better at school, or that skill and knowledge wasn't recognised by the schooling system, where we could tick it off on a report card or something like that. At home, students do play across multiple devices often. Certainly that's what we've seen from the photography activity. So students are playing on PCs, on console systems, on tablets and so on, and they're doing that, they're playing those different types of games for different reasons and different purposes. I think this really aligns to what Joe was saying about not making an assumption that, home gameplay is any one thing. It's multiple, complex variety of things. Students do have very different situations at home in terms of how long they can play, the family rules for play, who they can play with, whether they're allowed to play, once their homework is completed and all of those kinds of things. And the socio-material demands of the school, so the physical spaces of the school, the ways in which schools are arranged and so on, make a real difference to how a game gets used in a classroom to how it might get used at home. So, young people might be used to playing a game on the lounge in front of the TV in a very relaxing kind of way at home, but at school, they're required to play in a very specific kind of way often, in a very tight time frame, for instance. And that changes the nature of play. There are all these kinds of barriers or issues to exploring this further. So it's difficult to get accurate data on home gameplay unless we kind of follow students home and, keep account of what they're doing on a moment-by-moment basis. It's difficult to compare school and not school and to kind of think about what these different imagined spaces are to compare school to home. It's difficult to generalise across different kinds of schools, different age groups, different subject areas and so on. And it is, there is this real challenge of what counts as learning and knowledge development. So implications, I think, are that, we can't assume, as Joe said, we can't assume that gameplay will necessarily engage students. I mean, obviously, there are lots of ways in which we've seen students engaged and having lots of fun throughout the project, and that's wonderful, but we can't assume that games will necessarily engage students. We can't assume that they will have a consistent home gaming experience. And we do need to recognise that as a resource, as something we introduce into the classroom, games are very complex systems. They're complex educational resources and therefore require complex pedagogical responses.
Okay, today I'm going to talk about pedagogy. So I'm really following on, instead of looking at students, the use of games, I'm trying to give you a background of what teachers are thinking in regard to their teaching practices and how they go about using games in their classroom. Our question that I had to look at was the ways teachers can work with games most effectively and the kinds of pedagogical practices and approaches that best capitalise on the use of games. So when I think about this, the first thing I think about when you talk about pedagogy is teacher beliefs. So the idea that really how teachers think about the way children learn has a massive impact on the way they teach. So if they think children learn by them telling them how to go about something, then they'll teach like that. So when you look at that, all the beliefs that teachers have about how children learn affect their teaching, also the way they present their content, and the impact of technology on that. So what does that actually look like in classrooms? So to give you a little bit of background, to really understand pedagogy, we've got to go firstly to beliefs. So it's epistemic beliefs, so beliefs about knowledge. And what I did was try to look at different theories around beliefs, and I then put a framework together to try to help me analyse what teachers were saying about the use of games in classrooms. So Perry developed one in 1970, but it's a nice, easy structure to follow. So one of the first initial ideas around epistemic beliefs is dualistic. So it's right or wrong knowledge handed down by authority. So that's what teachers believe. Or you then move into the multiplistic. So there's possible views about knowledge, but knowledge is definitely still a certain thing. Then we move to relativistic. So knowledge as tentative and contextual and generated by the self. So we've moved from handed down by authority to generated by self. And then relativism, where knowledge is definitely uncertain and based on accumulated weights of evidence. So depending on how you think about knowledge and how knowledge is gained will depend on how you actually teach. So which view you take on that. Also playing into the gambit of pedagogy is understanding about pedagogical beliefs themselves. So if we think about any type of technology, we could put them into sort of four sort of frameworks here. So do I want to teach the skill, the gaming skill? That's what I'm interested in. Or is it going to be supplementary? Like teachers use a lot of electronic sheets and things like that. So they've literally turned their hard copy sheets into electronic format. So it's a way of supplementing curriculum. Or they might use it as a learning tool. So things like getting children to collaborate together and talk. That's another way of using it. Or it's like emerging different sort of curriculum approaches. So problem-based learning and using the game as a tool to leverage that, or technology as a tool for leveraging that. Then we have to look at pedagogical practices. So we can move from something like a very teacher-centred model to a student-centred model. But there's a lot of mixes in between. You can't say someone's definitely orientated just teacher-centred. So I sort of looked at a mixed balance between teacher-centred, student-centred. So there's a sort of continuum about different sort of pedagogical practice in that regard. But you have the sage on the stage idea where the teacher's up the front talking. So that's the instructional model. Then you have the revelatory model where teachers present ideas and activities in a certain sequence for children to develop that concept. Or you can move on to conjectural, where you ask children to manipulate and form knowledge hypotheses. So putting all that together, I developed a framework to try to look at the case studies I was working with to really understand what informed pedagogical practices and why they were shaped the way they were. So to give you an example, I had a case study of a teacher working with games, and when she first came onto the project, she was interested in games, but she thought we were talking about board games. So she had quite she wasn't very technical at all. She wasn't that interested in games. So she thought, what do I do? So she had a younger year class, so she gave the children a reading tutorial and set them up, and she followed the instructional model of I do, we do, you do. So she sat the kids in front of the class and she showed them the game, so I do. Then she got the kids playing the game in front of everybody else, we do. And then she got the kids doing the game, you do. So it's very much that instructional model. So if you look at that framework in that regard, she's using a dualistic view of epistemic knowledge. She's focusing on developing rudimentary skills and the development of a teacher-centred approach. The children are at a doing level, so they're responding to the computer. And she herself has a low technology ability. What then happened, which started to disrupt this idea of her beliefs, was the kids started to get bored. And she said, why are they getting bored? You know, they're interacting with the game. And she started thinking, oh, this is not working. What do I do? So she let the kids go in at any stage of that tutorial game. So when they felt more in control, they felt better about engaging in the game. And then when we had our discussions, as we worked with the teachers quite intensely, she said to me, I know I'm not doing this right. I know you want something more. which was interesting. So she had that sort of shift in her belief. She knew there was something else I could do with the game, but she wasn't too sure what that would be. So she said, this time I'd like to try a game you suggest that is better for them. And I said to her, look at your kids. What are they interested in? So she said, they're interested in Minecraft. And I said, okay, let's think. So she didn't do the I do, we do, you do Minecraft because she knew that wasn't going to work. So what she first did was set up the children in different rotations. So she then let them just play, and after their gameplay and experience with Minecraft, they wrote about what they were doing, and they loved it. But then she thought, that's not enough. I want to do something more. So then she decided that she would do a unit of work around the local area. So she then got the kids doing some development of history in the local area and got them in groups building their own Minecraft communities. So they would look at the relationship between how many pools or how many hospitals or, you know, how many schools they needed, and they were creating. And in the end, they then had to sell their Minecraft world. So a totally different approach to her using games. She'd moved more to the relative epistemic views of knowledge. There were new ways of learning to her. She was primarily student-centred, so she moved from a teacher-centred approach to a student-centred approach, and the children were doing more of the sharing knowledge together, creating knowledge, thinking about concepts. But still, her technology, her own competency was low. And I found that interesting. It doesn't matter how low in competency you are. It's really thinking about your views of knowledge and how you want to see that game played out. And the journey she took through using games really showed the different approaches to pedagogy and the fundamental things that feed that pedagogy. So when we look at the key findings of this, initially we found that teachers use games the way they normally use any other technology tool. That's the first sort of way they do it. So they just bring it in the current pedagogy that they have. When you try to change or disrupt or make them think outside the square in regard to their views, you have to get them to do something first, because the doing has to come first before the change happens. So it's that, idea that change in behaviour precedes change in belief. And the last thing is we have a movement towards a relativistic views of knowledge, and it's mainly based in conjectural, student-based centred practices. That's it. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jason Zagami, and I'm going to be looking at the topic of opportunities for creativity, production and innovation during the project. So first off, we started looking at the skills, knowledge and understandings called upon when students engage with games or create games. And over time, this sort of expanded to look at the game worlds that encompass the games that students were looking at, the gameplay and the game making, and more as the context used for student learning rather than as the foundation of the learning itself. During the project, we used a whole lot of different research approaches in terms of collecting data, and you can see some of those there. And in particular, I used the framework of secondary worlds, which is the imaginative world that students build around games as a framework for analysis of these. First aspect of creativity was that in the learning context that students could engage with, they had opportunities then for identity development, looking at rankings and getting reward for being recognised as a good game player, and more when students were getting into game making, recognised in terms of their skills and knowledge around game making. And that extended to modding, which is the modification of existing games, which is another area that students use a lot in terms of the creativity around gameplay. And then into the actual area of co-creation, where students don't just physically change the game, but change how they use the game in terms of creating stories about the game or creating costumes or other aspects of gameplay to incorporate into their play life or into their other learning. and at the other extreme of actually making their own games and extending that into making their own game worlds in which to imaginatively explore and engage creativity. So 3 aspects of that. First is rapid problem solving, where students can try out lots and lots of different approaches with the use of games. So instead of just being restricted to one particular approach, they can rapidly go through a whole range of different approaches to a particular task, or in this case, playing games to overcome a challenge, and try them out. This then promotes risk-taking, initially in the gameplay itself, but then also in their own identity development around the use of avatars, trying out different personas in various games, particularly multiplayer games and things like that. And then just in the games themselves. Because they're playing a game, students can be more risk-taking in terms of their engagement with the curriculum areas. So in some of our schools, we're looking at religious education or areas of science or mathematics, where students may be able to take more risks in a game persona than they may otherwise do. Then that leads into simulations, where we explored a range of different simulations during the project. The Statecraft X simulation, where students looked at managing an entire economy and society, and various other simulations where students can try out ideas and ways that the world works through simulations. That then leads on to production. Now, as I mentioned, there's a whole aspect of fan fiction where students can write about their games or create artworks or music about the game environments or characters in their games. Collaborative writing of fiction leads on from that, but there's also collaborative writing of non-fiction. A lot of students blog about their games. The Minecraft wiki is on par with Wikipedia, and it's all been created by players of the game, where they've all contributed their ideas to a collaborative writing task. Then it leads into areas of cosplay and creation of avatars, and then through to machinima, where they can create videos of their experiences of their characters in their games. And then we've had researchers look at performative representations, where the actual process of creating within games is also part of identity formation. And then game making itself, where students are actually building their own games to address some of these aspects. This then leads into innovation, and particularly I've used this to look at how students, teachers, impact upon the curriculum and impact upon professional development have been progressing. Some of you may be familiar with the SAMA model, which is a model that looks at teacher innovation with educational technologies, and I've applied that to use of gameplay. We're initially looking at gameplay as substituting, looking for a game that will teach a specific concept or replace a particular aspect of the curriculum. Then moving into the use of game building as a process whereby students will work through making a game, often directed by a teacher, as a process that's fairly standardised. But then moving to a more transformative process where using gameplay as a general context. So allowing students to explore their writing through game characters or game worlds, looking at mathematics from the perspective of how mathematics works within a particular game or science works within that, looking at historical simulations and geographical simulations and exploring those. And then finally moving on from that, not just to making their own games, but also modding games and writing about games through co-creation, where they're expanding upon the game and adding to that world. So they have to understand the world and have to understand our world in order to effectively contribute to their fantasy world or their game world that they're creating. Big aspect though in that is that not all students enjoy games in the same way. The project survey showed that Minecraft was by far, by a factor of 3, the most popular game. But similarly by a factor of 3, it was the most unpopular game. So even Minecraft, which is held up to be the gold standard of student gaming, is not popular with a whole range of students. So there's a whole range of different affordances around games where some students will like different types of games, different genres, different approaches, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Likewise, different teachers will engage well with different types of games, different genres and so forth. And then there's the whole division still between students seeing games primarily for recreation, while teachers are seeing them, certainly in the project, in terms of an educational perspective, primarily for an educational goal. And that overlays on the different taxonomies of different preferences within games. And finally, looking at the TPAC model, which is used to allow teachers to make decisions around appropriate uses of technology in schools and considering games, or computer games, as another technology, I've looked at this as a GPAC model, whereby with the TPAC model, you've got technology, processes, and content, and how they interact. But that left out one significant factor, which was the student. And the student's preferences for different pedagogies, different games, and different content areas is also an important factor in making decisions about the appropriate uses of games. And that just shows, in terms of the four-dimensional interactions between those four areas, the complexity that is involved in making decisions about appropriate uses of games in the classroom. And that's my time up, and we'll now pass on to Catherine.
I'm going to talk about one particular school, one particular unit of work that allowed me to explore digital literacies. Of course, like all the work, this runs right across the project, but this seemed to me a good opportunity to talk to you and to look in detail at the ways multimodal literacies were enabling particular kinds of multimodal literacies, and games were enabling particular kinds of learning. So the focus of this area was to learn more about digital literacies and multimodal learning through games. And our objective was to find out what literacy looks like in games-based contexts and explore the use of games and games-based pedagogies to foster high-level critical, cultural and operational competence in print and digital literacies. And we were fortunate, as I mentioned earlier, to have as one of our project partners Professor Yamsan Chi from the National Institute of Education in Singapore. And this was a mobile phone game that Yamsan and his colleagues developed to teach citizenship education, and we were using it in one of our project schools in Year 9. As all the project schools in Queensland were actually named as industry partners, we're very proud to have been associated with this school, and we have written about the work, and I hope you'll have a chance to read it at some stage. So, Statecraft X. In Statecraft X, as you can see, it's a fantasy world. This is one of the games that Jason mentioned just now. I'll leave you to read that for yourselves for a moment. So, we were fortunate to be able to work with Peter McVie, one of our project teachers, and he took responsibility for implementing this in his Year 8 SOS classroom. Prior to playing the game with the students in school, we had a trial run where I learned more than I needed to know, really, about how mean and nasty my colleagues were, where I lost very thoroughly. But so we trialled it ourselves and then introduced it to the school. In this class, there were we divided the students into groups of 6. There were 4 teams, and they played over a 3-week period. We did it in per term doesn't mean per term; it means per team. And an important characteristic of this game was that students got to play it at home, and we used school time. Peter used school time to discuss it and to take the curriculum forward. This was quite an deliberate decision on Yamsan's part, because he wanted, as far as possible, to replicate the game-playing experience that kids had out of school, where they could play anytime, anywhere, rather than having to do it within some of these school parameters. So, a very interesting exploration of how to make use of those in and out of school differences without behaving as though it's only at home or only at school. Michael mentioned James G's work before, and he's been one of the most influential thinkers in terms of us helping understand about how games and literacy and learning are all intertwined. And what I'm talking about today, I really want to focus on those non-verbal forms of literacy. And if you think about the size of a mobile phone and the complexity of the image, the complexity of the information that students needed to understand, this question of different forms of symbols and meaning making becomes really important. So he says in his wonderful book, What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy, He says, learning about and coming to appreciate interrelations within and across multiple science systems, images, words, actions, symbols, artefacts, etc., as a complex system is core to the learning experience. All aspects of the learning environment are set up to encourage passive and active and critical, not passive learning. So the class ran for 3 weeks. During that period, Jason and I and Roberta spent a lot of time in the classes, observing the classes. We interviewed the teacher, we interviewed the students, we took notes, we did analysis of screenshots. We also had blogs that Peter had made about the game, and although I haven't put it up there, we also, of course, had our own experience of playing the game as insiders, so we had a fairly nuanced sense of some of the processes that the kids were going through as they worked through the world of the game parallel to the and related to the work they were doing at school. So we found that the students did need to be able to understand what the images and symbols meant in order to make sense of the game. That with this information they were able to make sophisticated decisions about what to do, what had happened, all on the basis of information gained through these systems. But as Yam-San would be the first to emphasise, one of the things that made this so important was that the kids were actually personally invested in it, and that for him and for G, and I think for us in the project, an awareness of how much, you know, of the importance of putting yourself in there and wanting to do it and being part of it and inhabiting that world makes a huge difference. Like Michael, I wanted to make points about there being barriers or issues. And the key thing I'd say is that it's not all games. You know, not all games are created equal. This was a really good one. This game was specifically designed to replicate elements of out-of-school play experience with anytime, anywhere play. It had very high-level production values, especially for an educational game, and was designed to promote high-level commitment, thinking and reflection. And thirdly, it was specifically targeted to fit into school curriculum and timetables. So the implications that I draw from this study that this confirms for me, seeing what the students were doing and seeing the kinds of comments that Peter was making, and also doing the sorts of analysis that we've done, that they do indeed have the capacity to develop deep understandings of curriculum areas. The role of the teacher is crucial. It's not just as Joe was saying, you know, Microsoft Inc. replaces teaching Inc. It's much more integral than that. Critical digital literacy and high-level knowledge of multimodal literacy is essential to successful gameplay. There's lots of opportunities, or there's lots of potential or future in schools capitalising on these kinds of multimodal literacies to support learning. But I would also want to emphasise, and it came through again and again and again, that the traditional literacies remain important alongside multimodal literacies. We can't afford to ignore either.
Hi everyone, I'm Leonie. I'm going to be talking to you about assessment. Within the Serious Play project, there were 2 dimensions to our assessment focus. We were interested in considering whether or not we need an assessment framework to think about the literacies and capabilities made possible through the use or the analysis or the creation of digital games. And we were interested also in trialling and possibly extending an existing assessment framework that had been put together for using and assessing online artefacts and products that had previously been put together by a couple of the authors mentioned there, Claire Wyatt-Smith in particular. So we did a lot of data collection around this to think more about the issue of assessment. Does anybody have a game that they're currently playing a lot on their phone or their iPad, or any little games they're obsessed with? No one's going to admit to this now, but this is a safe environment to admit that you're interested in playing games. What do you like to play, Jo?
Well, I'm playing a game, it's an indie game, and it's called Bonza.
Bonza. And how do you know when you're doing well in Bonza, Jo? What sort of feedback do you get? Oh, stars, lovely.
The exciting noise that comes.
Excellent.
Digital noise.
Yes.
And it also goes Bonza.
That's very subtle, isn't it? Does anybody else have a game that they like to play? For example, yeah.
I'm playing a game called Pandemic.
Pandemic. And how do you know when you're doing well in Pandemic?
Well, you're trying to save the world from disease.
Okay.
So, you can see where the disease is spread around the world, so the less lit up it is, the better it is.
Beautiful. So in a lot of our common gaming experiences, sort of an inbuilt assessment and feedback that takes place. And sometimes that's a bit confronting. Like I've recently made the mistake of starting to play Words with Friends with my children who are 13 and discovered that sometimes they're quite a bit better than me. It's a little upsetting. So in our day-to-day gameplay, we're familiar with assessment along the way, but we don't think of it as assessment. It's feedback that tells us how we're going and gives us advice on whether we need to change things, try something different or so on. But when we're bringing games into classroom, this is one of those things that shifts between the out-of-school and the in-school context. People want to know, yes, that's very well, but how do we integrate it into the rest of our practices, including assessment? So we were quite fascinated to think about how teachers would deal with this. So we did a lot of data collection around this. In addition to the school visits and analysis of what was happening in the school sites that people have spoken about already today, we had 3 intensely focused conversations with different groups of teachers about assessment, and we had 3 different prompts for those. The first one was looking at the assessment model by Claire Wyatt-Smith and Kay Kimber, which they'd put together for helping teachers think about how well students are creating digital text or online texts, and whether or not we needed a similar sort of model for assessing how students worked with games. Then we had another discussion about assessment and the Australian curriculum, where we asked people to think about whether or not the outcomes mapped in the curriculum could actually be matched up to the experiences the teachers were having with games and what students were achieving. And then we had another one, which was a reflection on what they had noticed about the experience, what they learned, and what sort of feedback they would give to other people working in the area. So this is the sort of things that we found. Everybody was consistent in saying that there is a lot of knowledge and a lot of skill development through the work with games that happened in diverse areas with diverse students of diverse ages across all areas of the curriculum. There didn't appear to be any particular area that people were negative about or saw as unable to benefit from the use of games. That this could also be mapped to the cross-curriculum priorities and general capabilities or 21st century skills, whichever ones you want to think about, including some of the ones that Jason was talking about before. Because we were obviously really interested in what teachers have to say, I've included some quotes from the teachers here to give an insight into this. So the first key finding was we don't need a new model for assessing things. We don't need to learn new things about assessment. Our existing assessment practices are able to recognise most and the major learning outcomes. So people, for example, you might recognise yourself up here, somebody, that it's simply a matter of looking at the curriculum documents and making the connections. It's quite possible to align your game plan, your game playing to the curriculum. Takes a bit of planning and preparation, the point that Michael was making before, but it's a relatively logical connection to be able to make. Associated with that, of course, is the conclusion that there is no need for a special or modified approach to assessment in order to respond to the use of games. And people made a lot of analogies here saying, well, if we assess through debates or through a project or a poster or an online text, we don't come up with some fancy new assessment approach for that. We assess it as the way that we normally do. And they make the same point here as well. If we gave a child or a student a board game, why wouldn't we assess it the same manner if they were just doing it in game style? Provided they're following, ticking off the content or what's required, then they should be assessed in a similar way, which was a common analogy that was used. Alongside that, of course, there was the recognition that accessibility is not the only justification for the use of games. And this has come through in everyone's presentations today as well. That even though we can assess it, the fact that we can assess it shouldn't distract our attention from the fact that there are other benefits that might not need to be assessed. And a lot of the participants made points like this. So we don't always have to have a rubric or assess these things. You don't always have to be able to assess things like being able to think on the fly or problem solve or being thrown a curved ball and knowing what to do with it. It doesn't always come down to that pen and paper having to tick things off, which was an excellent companion idea to sit alongside the notion of assessment that has already been come up. And another point was that even if an actual project working with games isn't directly assessed in itself, it does still often benefit students' performances in other more formal assessment tasks. So there was an example there about the language learning space game, which wasn't directly assessed, but it impacted upon their skill development and the achievement in assessment tasks further down the track. And there was an acknowledgement that teachers can monitor the diverse outcomes that flow from working with games, just as they monitor the diverse outcomes that might flow from a group work project or having kids do a debate or build a project together, including learning how to work together, collaboration and communication. So the final point was that working with games opens up possibilities for some at-risk children to achieve academic success that could actually be officially assessed, a point that was also made by a couple of our other presenters. There were, of course, people who acknowledged that considering games and assessment has the same kinds of issues in relation to games generally. It does take time. You might struggle sometimes to find a direct alignment with the curriculum, and if you have a lack of game playing experience or knowledge, that can lead to a lack of confidence. But the implications for that is that the potential for learning with, from, through games to be assessed within the existing frameworks, as we've documented in this project and will continue to report on, might actually encourage other teachers to begin to experiment in this space, because we're always under pressure to justify choices that we make. And sharing stories of projects with games has a major impact upon teacher confidence generally, and this flows into assessment. That's me done.
My name's Sandy Musprat, and I'm going to be presenting a very quick overview of the survey data. The survey was conducted in schools in the 2 states, and even though I've separated the findings according to state, I'm going to focus mostly on the overall data because of time. The data still needs some cleaning. As we'll see in a moment, there's still some data cleaning issues in the findings. Students not reading questions properly, that sort of thing. So we need to sit down with probably Roberta, maybe Catherine, maybe Jo, to try and work out just the last few issues. But basically we've got 240 students across the 2 states from 8 schools. You said there were 9 schools in but one of the schools wasn't there. 15 teachers, but there is also we were taking what kids had written for the name of your teacher, and so there's a couple of there that just didn't make sense. We've got far many more boys in the sample than girls, but that's probably because of St Lawrence and Nudgee, would that be correct? Being boys' schools. And I had to go at trying to divide the sample into primary and secondary students as well. More primary students than secondary. Looking at the students according to age and according to year level or grade that the students were in, here we can see that there are a couple of issues. We've got kids that reckon they're in grades 11 and 12. I don't think there were any grade 11s and 12s in the sample. Maybe they misread the question and were responding with respect to age. I'm not sure what's going on there. But yeah, there's a couple of kids there that think they are, that we need to look at in grade 11 and 12. Most of the sample were either in grade 9 or in grade 6. The majority of the kids were at about that 10, 11, 12 years old, or the 13, 14, 15 year old. That just divides them by state. How often do you play games outside of school? Most of the students were saying sometimes, which I think is about 1 to 5 hours a week, not much, but there is a substantial number there that were playing a lot. That's more than 10 hours per week, more than 2 hours a day, something like that. And what is your favourite game in an out-of-school context? Minecraft is by far the most favourite game. Then we get the Call of Duty, FIFA, Grand Theft Auto, and those sorts of games. All of the games in the list this year are actual games. I was able to track them down on the web. Every one of them has a web page or a Wikipedia page or something like that. I haven't tried to classify the games in any way. All I've done so far is make sure we've got consistent spellings and collapsed versions of the games to a common version. We get this sort of pattern for the complete distribution. We've got a small number of games at the top that a lot of kids are playing, and then we've got a whole host of games in the long tail that only 1 or 2 kids are playing. Some of those games down in that long tail could be collapsed, but it's not going to change the picture substantially. And when we split it by state, we get those pictures. Minecraft is still at the top for both states. We asked the kids about sort of social and cultural aspects of game playing and how important these aspects were to the kid when they are playing their favourite game, that game that they've just listed. And we asked the kids to rate the importance on a 3-point scale from very important, important to not important at all. And then we also gave them the option of saying, well, that particular aspect just doesn't apply to the game that I am playing. And also there's a don't know option there as well. So the list is arranged in decreasing order of the number of kids who said the game was important in some way. Either they ticked the very important or the important box. And so at the top of the list there, the most important aspects according to, for these kids, are making progress, meeting challenges, discovery, the way the game looks, being easy to use and getting ahead. Sort of aspects to do with the game itself. Whereas at the bottom of the list, we tend to find sort of more the social aspects of playing games, getting to know other players, learning how to make avatars, chatting with other players, those sorts of things at the bottom of the list. Now, for a lot of these kids, the sort of game that they're playing is, the sort of game that is just a sole player. It's just one of those little web-based games, mini clips, those sorts of things that don't involve avatars or playing with other people or that sort of thing. And you'll notice that at the bottom of the list, there's a tendency for the does not apply to increase there as well. And even when we do get to the bottom of the list, though, we still find a substantial number of kids are saying these aspects of gameplay are important to them. So there's a lot of work that can be done in and around that table, and looking at associations not only within that set of variables, but also looking at associations with other aspects, with other variables in the survey. Is there a gender thing going on, an age thing happening here? Is there a state-based thing happening here? And also if we can find interesting ways to classify the games in that previous slide, are there associations between what they're saying here and the type of game that they're playing? And divide them up by state. Then we move to games in the classroom. The question that was put to the students is, do you think computer games can help you learn in the classroom? The overwhelming majority of the kids said yes, but there is a small number of 10% of them. So in this sample, that would roughly work out about 25 students said no, and then there was also another 17% who were not sure. Those who said no to this question, I think they were redirected around the next set of questions. So the sample size drops by the number of kids that said no. What do you think computer games in the classroom can help students to learn? The bright red segment there is the bit that is the proportion that said yes to a particular aspect of learning. One of the things that strikes me about the picture is that there's not much difference between the top end of the list and the bottom end of the list. 178 said making things interesting is something that games can teach in the classroom. At the bottom of the list, you've got 131 students agreeing that learning about computers is something that games can teach you in the classroom. There's not that much difference between the top end and the bottom of the list. They're not discriminating, if you like. But it would be still of interest to find out what sort of a kid is saying no to these questions. Here we do get differences between the top end and the bottom end of the list. The kids are discriminating about what they see as potential problems with using games in the classroom. So at the top end of the list, the kids are saying yes to these could be problems, to things like you mightn't finish the game. Some students might play parts that they weren't meant to. It might take too long. Games might crash the school systems. These sorts of things. At the bottom of the list, the kids are not agreeing with aspects such as computers are not suitable for school. I don't think that's a big problem. The majority of the kids are saying that's not a problem. Parents would not want me to play games at school. That's not a problem for these kids. Not enough classroom equipment. That tends to be not a problem these days. And teachers don't know enough about computer games. That's not a problem these days either. But there is like 77 odd students there that are saying that, yes, it is a problem. And we divide it by state. Okay, have you used computer games in the classroom? The majority of the kids have said yes. In what topic has that game been used? We're finding that most of the kids are using them in the maths, science, technology areas, then with English and languages, and then at the bottom of the list we've got media, health and PE and religion. Question about a section in the survey about making games in the classroom. Most of the questions in this section were open-end response questions, and so I haven't got much to present here because I didn't delve into the open response questions. But we've got 71, or nearly a third of the available samples said that they had made games in the classroom, which is, I think, quite a substantial number. 28 of the kids that could have responded to the question did not provide an answer though. And then we asked them what software they'd used to create that game in, and we got Scratch, Game Maker, Splotter, and a few using PowerPoint, Kahoots, and a small number who didn't know the software that they'd used. So there's much more in that section of the survey for analysis, but it's all open-ended response questions. Okay, then the next section was about topics of discussion in and around games in the classroom. The question was, did you discuss games as part of your classroom work? 87, more than a third, said that games were discussed in the classroom. What was the topic of discussion? At the top of the list here, we're getting things like the values, the ideas in a computer game, whether games are bad for you, computer games and their connections to other media. Towards the bottom of the list, still large numbers of kids saying yes, but things like the importance of computer games in people's lives, the story of the game, and advertising and those sorts of issues. And I think that's it from me. Thank you.